Welcome to IADS Retail Park. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're back for another deep dive, I'm Maya, and today we're examining a question that came from one of our members. What exactly makes Harrods different? The answer turned out to be more complex than expected. A single Knightsbridge building generating £24,000 per square meter and an 18% operating margin, numbers that dwarf most Western peers, but also a model facing 80 to 90 million pounds in losses from a single UK tax policy change. Joining me is Selvan, IADS, Managing Director and author of our latest exclusive on Harrods Landlord brand model. Selvan spent months researching everything from the store's freehold ownership to its customer concentration risks. Selvan, thanks for being here to unpack this with me.
Thanks for having me, Maya. This was one of those research projects that started with a simple member question, what makes Harrods different, and turned into something much more layered once we started pulling the threads.
And it really shows in the piece. Let's start with what jumped out at me immediately. £24,000 per square meter in revenue density and an 18% operating margin. Those numbers dwarf most Western peers. What's driving that performance?
Well, Maya, it comes down to two structural decisions made decades ago. The first is the concession model. About 70% of Harrods floor space operates on concession or consignment terms. That means brands control product, staffing, and visual merchandising, while Harrods collects commission or minimum rent. Inventory risk stays with the brands, not on Harrods' books. You end up with 330 brand-managed spaces generating gross margins that most department stores can't touch because they're still carrying buy risk. The second piece is freehold ownership. Harrods acquired the Knightsbridge block outright in 1921. No rent inflation, no landlord renegotiations, no balance sheet drag from leasehold liabilities. When you look at competitors like Cadaway, which filed for insolvency in 2024 citing rising index-linked rents, or Selfridges, whose property vehicle took a £638 million write-down, you see how rare and valuable that freehold status is.
So what you're describing is really two layers of risk elimination, one at the product level and one at the property level. Most department stores are fighting battles on both fronts simultaneously, while Harrods structured itself to avoid both. But I know from reading the exclusive that it's not without trade-offs. Where does the model start to show cracks, Selvan?
The most immediate pressure is fiscal, not competitive. In January 2021, the UK abolished VAT-free shopping for non-EU visitors. That single policy change redirected high-spending tourists toward Paris and Milan. Walpole, the luxury trade body, estimates that West End retailers lost £220 million in the first half of 2024 alone. Internal modeling suggests Harrods' share of that was £80 to £90 million in lost Chinese and Gulf spend in 2024. No concession model or freehold advantage offsets a policy shift of that magnitude. You're losing top-line revenue before operational efficiency even comes into play.
That's the kind of external shock that exposes how much even the most optimized business model depends on the broader policy environment. You can perfect your operations, but if the government changes the rules on who shops in your store, all that optimization only goes so far. What about the customer concentration issue? Because the numbers there tell a similar story about vulnerability.
Right. Harrods disclosed in its ESG report that just 4% of active shoppers account for 28% of revenue. That level of concentration is both a strength and a fragility. On one hand, it shows how well the VIC programs and private client services work, by appointment suites, the residents, the platinum loyalty tier. On the other hand, any geopolitical shock that affects that ultra-high net worth segment reverberates disproportionately. Sanctions on Russian or Middle Eastern elites, corrections in luxury equity valuations, disruptions to Gulf air routes, all of those hit harder when your revenue is that concentrated.
It's a classic high-risk, high-reward trade. When those 4% are spending, they're driving nearly a third of your business. But the flip side is that your entire top line becomes sensitive to things completely outside your control. sanctions, flight routes, currency fluctuations, and then there's the ownership structure. Qatar Investment Authority has been taking consecutive £180 million dividends. What does that tell us about how they're thinking about Harrods?
It could signal a shift from patient, long duration capital stewardship to cash harvesting. QIA may be funding other diversification projects across its portfolio, which is rational from their perspective. But for Harrods, it tightens reinvestment headroom. There's a £200 million refurbishment underway right now, reshaping sales floors into what they call experiential precincts. If dividend extraction continues at this pace, management may face trade-offs between maintaining that level of capital investment and keeping the balance sheet comfortable. It's not a crisis, but it changes the calculus.
So you're seeing a potential tension between what the ownership needs financially and what the business needs strategically to stay competitive. And then there's the building itself, which is both the brand's greatest asset and, as you describe it, a bit of a shackle. Can you explain that tension?
The Knightsbridge block is a Grade 2 listed building. That designation protects its architectural and historical significance, but it also means every structural alteration requires listed building consent from Westminster. Planning files show that process can extend beyond 8 months, even for minor plumbing or ductwork changes. Compare that to the speed at which luxury merchandising is moving right now. Brands want theatrical, fast-turn activations, pop-ups, installations, rapid reconfigurations. Harrods has the capital and the will, but the building's heritage status acts as a governor on agility.
That's the irony of owning a landmark property. You eliminate the landlord risk, but you inherit a different kind of constraint, one that's harder to negotiate with because it's embedded in law. A newer building or a lease space might cost you more in rent, but at least you have the flexibility to reconfigure quickly when the market demands it. Selvan. It sounds like Harrods is operating in a very different speed lane than what luxury retail increasingly requires.
And it raises a broader question about monumentalism in retail. Harrods works because it combines freehold ownership, concession economics, sovereign wealth backing, and ultra-high net worth customer concentration. Remove any one of those elements, and the model changes dramatically. Most retailers can't replicate even 2 of those conditions, let alone all 4.
Which makes it almost a case study in what's not replicable rather than what is. Let's talk about the concession model a bit more because I think it's easy to hear brands carry the inventory risk and assume that's purely an advantage. But you point out in the exclusive that it also limits pricing power and merchandising control. How does that play out in practice?
When brands control the space, they control the narrative, Maya. Harrods can curate which brands appear and negotiate commission rates, but it can't dictate pricing, markdown strategies, or even product allocation the way a buyer-led department store can. If a brand decides to prioritize its directly operated stores or other wholesale partners, Harrods has limited leverage. That's why the Tom Ford women's store is such a notable example. It's the only location outside Tom Ford's own network. That kind of exclusivity is what makes the concession model work at scale, but it depends on brand willingness to cede control, which is not a given.
So the power dynamic is more balanced than it appears. Harrods may control the real estate, but brands control the product and the allocation decisions. And presumably that gets harder as competitive scale migrates east. You mentioned SKP Beijing hitting RMB 26.5 billion, about 2.9 billion pounds in 2023. If luxury brands are allocating limited edition product based on absolute volume, Harrods could start losing some of that exclusivity edge.
That's the risk. SKP, Shinsegae Gangnam, Isetan Shinjuku, they're all demonstrating that purchasing power and brand influence are clustering in Asia's megamalls. Harrods opened a private member club in Shanghai in 2024, which is interesting strategically. It's a way to maintain visibility and brand presence in that market, potentially giving them leverage when negotiating allocations with luxury brands who want access to those high-spending Chinese customers, even when they're not traveling to London.
So it's almost a geographic hedge, staying relevant in the conversation, even if the shopping itself is happening elsewhere. Before we wrap up this episode, I want to touch on one more thing: technology. You note in the exclusive that Harrods order management systems are largely monolithic, and average fulfillment sits around 2 days, while Selfridges has moved to microservices and advertises 24-hour fulfillment. In a market where speed increasingly equals service, how much does that gap matter?
It matters more as the baseline expectation shifts. Premium shoppers increasingly benchmark their experience against platforms like Farfetch that offer next-day delivery. Harrods has spent about £75 million updating its tech stack since 2018 and completed an SAP customer data rebuild in 2023, so they're investing. But the architecture is harder to change when you're layering updates onto older systems. Selfridge's microservice approach gives them more flexibility to iterate quickly. For Harrods, the question is whether a 2-day fulfillment lag becomes a visible friction point that affects conversion, especially for younger luxury consumers who expect speed.
It reminds me of what you said earlier about the building constraints. You can have all the capital in the world, but if the underlying infrastructure, whether it's a listed building or legacy IT systems, wasn't designed for the speed the market now demands, you're playing catch up in a race where the finish line keeps moving. Sylvan, this has been a really valuable conversation. For anyone wanting the full breakdown, the revenue density comparisons, the peer analysis, all the financials, where should they go?
The full IADS exclusive is available on our Substack and on our website. We've also got this episode and others on the IADS Retail Park podcast feed, and you can follow us on LinkedIn and Substack at IADS. Exclusive insights.
Perfect. Sylvan, thank you for walking us through almost 2 centuries of reinvention and helping us understand what makes this model work and where it's being tested.
Thanks for having me, Maya. It's always good to dig into these case studies with you.
For everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. The question we started with was simple: what makes Harrods different? But the answer reveals something larger about retail monumentalism itself. When does a fortress become a constraint? And when does concentration become fragility? And can a model built on 4 very specific conditions survive when any one of them shifts? Those questions matter beyond Knightsbridge. If you're running a department store, managing luxury retail, or thinking about capital allocation in physical space, Harrods offers both a blueprint and a warning. You'll find a link to the full exclusive in the episode description. Subscribe to the IADS Retail Park wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the conversation on Substack and LinkedIn. Until next time, keep questioning what works and why. This podcast uses AI cloned voices created with human oversight to ensure quality and accuracy.